Welcome everyone to Chained Opinion, and today we are diving into a question with some pretty huge implications for U.S. presidential power.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
We're asking, is it possible that a former president, in this case we're talking about Donald Trump, could actually make a serious run for a third term in office?
Mm.
I mean, doesn't the Constitution, totally block that?
Yeah, it's a question that really gets to the core of our system of government and the whole idea of limiting how long presidents can serve. So at the heart of this whole discussion is the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution.
Okay, so can you remind us what that amendment says?
Absolutely.
Just to make sure everyone listening is on the same page here.
So the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified way back in 1951, clearly states that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. And it's super important to note, this applies whether those terms are served one after the other or with breaks in between. So what we're really exploring here is whether a former president who's already served 2 terms can actually find a way, legally or politically, to serve a third.
Wow, that's a really tough question. It's not just a matter of wanting to run again. There are these big constitutional hurdles in the way.
Right, exactly. And we've actually seen former President Trump himself publicly address this idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in a recent interview, when he was asked directly about a third term, he said, and I'm quoting here, "No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking."
Okay, so he didn't rule it out.
Exactly. But he did add, it's far too early to think about it.
Interesting. So he's acknowledging it's on his mind, but saying it's not time to seriously consider it yet.
Yeah, you could interpret it that way.
But he didn't stop there, did he?
No, he went on to say, there are methods which you could do it, as you know. Although, at this point, he hasn't specified exactly what those legal or political strategies might be, so it really makes you wonder what he has in mind.
So it sounds like he knows there are constitutional barriers, but he thinks he can find a way around them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? He seems to be hinting that there might be some kind of loophole.
Like, what could he possibly be thinking?
Well, one idea that he mentioned, just as an example, is that his vice president, J.D. Vance, could potentially become president. And then maybe at some point Vance would step down, which would open up a path for Trump to take over. And importantly, Trump specifically said that this was just one possible approach.
Oh, so he's got other ideas.
That's right. He also said, but there are others too. But he didn't elaborate on those. So naturally, this leads us to speculate about what those other possibilities could be.
Okay, let's brainstorm. What are some ways, even if they're far-fetched, that Trump could try to get around the 2-term limit?
Well, the most straightforward, but probably the hardest way, would be to completely repeal the 22nd Amendment.
And how would that even work?
Constitutionally speaking, that's a really big challenge. You'd need a 2/3 majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then after that, 3/4 of the states, which is 38 out of 50, would have to ratify it. It's a huge task. Historically, getting that level of agreement across the country for a big change like this has been incredibly difficult. I mean, we're talking about changing the very foundation of how our government works.
So it's like climbing Mount Everest, technically possible, but incredibly difficult and risky.
That's a good analogy. And it's important to remember why the 22nd Amendment was even created in the first place. The idea of a president only serving 2 terms became really solid back when George Washington decided to step down after his 2 terms, way back in 1796. That became the norm for over 150 years. It was like an unwritten rule.
So Washington set a precedent that everyone followed.
Yeah, it was this really strong tradition. It wasn't until Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms in a row starting in 1933 during the Great Depression and World War II that this 2-term tradition was broken. But then Roosevelt died during his 4th term, and that really pushed Congress to make the 2-term limit official. And that's how we got the 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951. It was a way to ensure that no president could ever hold power for too long again.
So undoing that amendment would require a massive shift in how Americans think about the presidency.
Absolutely. It would be a huge deal. It wouldn't be impossible, but it would be a very tough path.
So we've talked about the constitutional hurdles, but what about Trump's allies? Have they said anything about how they might approach this?
Yes, they have. For example, Steve Bannon, who's been a longtime advisor to Trump, has said his team is looking into how the word term is actually defined in relation to presidential limits. They're basically trying to see if there's a loophole in the way we understand a presidential term. The exact details of what they're thinking haven't been made public yet, but it definitely suggests they're trying to come up with some creative legal arguments.
So it's like they're searching for a way to redefine what counts as a term, Maybe to argue that Trump hasn't actually served two full terms in a way that the 22nd Amendment would apply to.
It's an interesting strategy for sure.
And it seems like there's some people in Congress who are exploring options too.
Yeah, for instance, Representative Andy Ogles introduced a resolution that could potentially allow presidents to serve 3 terms.
Oh,
But there's a catch. Only 2 of those terms could be consecutive. So a president could serve 2 terms, take a break, and then potentially run for a third. This shows that there's at least some interest in finding a legislative solution to this, even though, as we've talked about, actually amending the Constitution is a really difficult process.
yeah. Changing the Constitution is no easy feat. So it seems like there's this push and pull, some people trying to work within the existing rules to find a loophole, and others maybe thinking about changing the rules entirely.
Right. It's a complex situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the politics and the Constitution, but what about the legal side of things? What are legal experts saying about all of this?
Well, it seems like most legal scholars agree that there aren't any strong legal arguments for just ignoring the 22nd Amendment. Like, it's pretty clear-cut. Constitutional law professor Jeremy Paul has been pretty vocal about this.
He's basically saying there's no magic legal trick to get around the 22nd Amendment.
Yeah, pretty much. And then you have election law professor Derek Miller, who's brought up this interesting point about the 12th Amendment.
Oh, right, the 12th Amendment. I'm kind of fuzzy on that one. Can you refresh my memory?
Of course. The 12th Amendment is all about who's eligible to be president and vice president. There's this key part of it that says, no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. Mueller's argument is that if the 22nd Amendment says someone can't be president for a third term, then they probably can't be vice president either.
So he's saying that the restriction on being president also applies to the vice presidency.
Yes, that's his interpretation. And this basically closes off the possibility of a former 2-term president trying to get back into the White House by becoming vice president first. It throws a wrench into that plan.
Wow, that's a pretty big roadblock. So if it's almost impossible legally and constitutionally to get around the 22nd Amendment, what about the political reality? I mean, could a former president even build enough support to make a realistic attempt at a third term?
Well, politically, going for a third term would require a level of agreement and cooperation that we've never seen before in the U.S. We're talking about everyone from federal and state officials to the judicial branch, and of course the voters themselves all having to be on board. And you can bet there would be tons of legal challenges every step of the way, which would really push the limits of constitutional law and our long-standing political norms.
Yeah.
It would be a huge, huge controversy.
A total political earthquake.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like the odds are really stacked against a former president even trying for a third term, let alone succeeding.
Yes, the 22nd Amendment is a major obstacle. While the former president has hinted at some strategies and his allies are looking into options, the legal and historical framework strongly suggests that overcoming this constitutional limit would be incredibly tough. It would take immense political will and also a really significant shift in the way Americans view the presidency, and that just doesn't seem very likely right now.
So it's not impossible, but it's super unlikely.
Right. And it's important to remember that public opinion matters. Trump has mentioned his poll numbers, claiming to have the highest poll numbers of any Republican for the last 100 years as a sign that people want him to have a third term. But how does that hold up against historical data?
Yeah, is he really that popular?
Well, he definitely has strong support within the Republican Party. But when we look at presidential approval ratings over time, the picture gets more complex. For example, Gallup polls show that President George W. Bush had a 90% approval rating after 9/11, and his dad, President George H.W. Bush, reached 89% after the Gulf War. Trump's highest approval rating during his second term, according to Gallup, was 47%. So while he's popular with his base, the claim of having the highest Republican poll numbers in a century might be a bit of an exaggeration.
So it doesn't seem like there's this groundswell of support for a third term that would make it politically unstoppable.
No, not really.
Okay, so it looks like no matter which way you slice it, the path to a third term is incredibly difficult, whether it's through legal loopholes, constitutional changes, or trying to rally public opinion.
Exactly. The challenges are huge and probably insurmountable.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into this question. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
My pleasure.
And for all of you listening, thanks for tuning in to Chained Opinion for this deep dive into the world of U.S. presidential power. Be sure to share this episode with anyone who might be interested, subscribe to our channel for more analysis of complex issues, and leave a comment. We're always curious to hear your thoughts. You can also find us as an audio podcast on YouTube Music and Spotify.
Until next time.
Now, as you go about your day, we want to leave you with this question. What are the biggest risks and potential consequences for American democracy if a former president actually tried to get a third term? And what does this possibility, even if it's unlikely, tell us about how strong our system of government really is?